Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about films, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Christy Vogler.
And I'm Elijah Fleming.
You might be wondering where Colin has run off to. Well, in honor of Women's History Month here in the States, we've decided to have a girls' night in to discuss Starz' first season of Spartacus titled Blood and Sand, which is a 2010 historical drama, action, / romance, according to Starz' website.
I can't take that seriously.
I think we will talk about the male idea of romance. We'll probably
continue.
Starring Andy Whitfield, Lucy Lawless, and John Hannah, which is based on the origins of Spartacus. And to help us dissect the bloody spectacle that is this series, we are joined once again by the lovely Alexandra Sills. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. As you all might remember, Alexandra is a postgraduate at the University of Leicester, a contributor to the website Bad Ancient, and the 2023 recipient of the Working Classicist of the Year Award. So we are happy to have her back, especially because she is our residential specialist of Roman spectacle, and oh boy, was this a spectacle. Yeah, we're going to just start off with our usual question. Alexandra, can you tell us how you first came to the series, and then let us know, do you dig season 1 of the series?
So I first watched it when it first came out, and this was before secondary education, and I just thought, I like Rome. This should be cool, right? And then thought, wow, I am not the target audience for this at all.
No.
So I gave up pretty quickly, and then I started watching it after going to uni and deciding to focus on spectacle, and I realised that actually I shouldn't have judged the book by its cover. That's not to say that I love it, but yeah, we'll get into it.
Oh yeah. All right. Lige, how about you?
I feel like I watched like a little bit, like maybe an episode when this first came out, but this was on Starz here, right? So I feel like I didn't really have access to it when it first came out. But I remember like one of my first or second years of grad school, like a bunch of classics graduate students getting together very late in the evening and deciding, wouldn't it be fun to watch Spartacus Blood and Sand? And we did that. And Colin was there.
I was going to ask, were there shots involved? Like,
there might as well have been. It was that kind of evening, and
it's that kind of show. Every time da-da-da happens,
yes,
take a shot, take a drink.
Mm-hmm.
And so I never actually finished the whole like season. I think I watched like another 1 or 2. But it's hard to, as you said earlier, it's hard to binge this because it's a whole lot. A lot of stuff, and I feel like HBO's Rome was kind of like the gritty historical echo of Gladiator, and this is the weirdly obscene, like fake blood splash echo of 300.
Nope.
And I think there are some interesting points in this, but wow, I do not dig it.
Yeah, I am, it's like that weird mixed bag that Zeus presents you, right? It's either all terrible or it's like a lot of bad and a lot of good in one bag, and it feels like this is where the season 1 ends up. I will say, as someone who had no idea that this show existed until I stupidly suggested we cover it.
I was like, really? Okay.
And then I proceeded to binge watch it in the last 24 hours, and I can say without a doubt that this show is unbingeable. Like, you should not do what I did, because that was a poor choice on my part. And I'm really curious because I think the other reason that I suggested we cover it is because Starz has decided to revive the series. And the new season's going to be called The House of Usher. So we're going to learn and it's literally a what if Usher survived whatever happens at Mount Vesuvius. So I haven't gotten that far yet. That is what it's going to be about. And I'm curious. It's like we don't necessarily have to talk about this a lot, but it's like I don't know how this would work in a streaming binge watching way if they keep the same tone that they did for season 1, because like there's so much naked bodies, and as I told Elijah, heaving bosoms, like those dresses,
literally swinging around,
uncomfortable.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
There's that, and make, you know, male bodies are the same way, and the bloodshed, both the really gross, like, oh, festering wounds, to like just hilarious blood splatter anytime they actually show fighting in the arena. So if you binge it, I was like, I'm just desensitized. It's like I'm sitting here eating my salad, being like, just bring it on, I'm fine at this point.
Which you could argue is pretty Roman, getting desensitized to it.
Yeah. And
True.
That's what I wonder, is like, is that going to be as successful? Because I think the intention is shock value, right? Like, to really, like, you get a nice break from it from week to week. Then like, you're kind of like, oh yeah, this is not what my daily life is like. This is nuts. What's happening here?
I mean, let's face it, I think this reboot is quite clearly a cash grab after Ridley Scott's cash grab of his pointless sequel.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, there's another series, I think it's going to be on Peacock, Where You Are. Roland Emmerich is doing something called Those About to Die. So all of this is a load of people saying, let's do it again and let's compete this time. So I think that's what I have so much pessimism for all three.
Yeah.
Same. Yeah. And I do kind of think that there are people who like to binge this type of thing, who like enjoy that bombardment over and over again. And so I feel like it is actually going to find its audience.
Oh, I was telling Alexandra, because I do want to discuss audience at some point, both like ancient audience as well as modern audience for the show. But like, I went and looked at the reviews on IMDb for the first season, and the amount of glowing reviews for this series, like just glowing. And you know, there are some that are probably more like us, or more like 5 or 6 maybe, or some that people are like, it's pure trash. I don't think it's pure trash. I will say that like there are some plot points and twists that I really enjoyed. But a lot of the times it was undermined by the supposed motivations of the characters that are like architects to those plot twists. So I'm sure we'll talk about that eventually. Yeah. So there's like parts of it I enjoyed, but I forget who said it, but it's like, this was not made for me at all.
Yeah, Alexandra was like, I'm not the target audience.
I mean, I am now, but I'm not sure I'm happy about it.
I do feel like in some ways this is like a trashy romance novel on screen.
Yeah.
A bodice ripper of the male persuasion.
Yes. In so many like avenues, I feel like this is very male gazy in all of the ways, but it's like, what if we had like the sexiest, most violent version of this story humanly possible?
I think the issue that I have with it is that the show is trying to be too many things at once and failing at all of them because of it. Because it isn't quite sure what it wants to be.
Yeah.
So it wants to be a historical drama, adventure, romance. That's what it wants to be.
I mean, there was an interview with a creator and he said he was approached, can you make a series that is R-rated? So he's obviously fulfilled that brief. But so you've got, I mean, it's not even softcore porn at some points. Gratuitous nudity, gratuitous violence. It's very much visually trying to be 300, which is obviously the fascist aesthetic of that. On the other hand, it's also following the tradition of Spartacus as almost a communist freedom fighter and abolitionist. It's got quite highly... some of the dialogue is quite serious, right? Some of it almost sounds like it could be a play from a couple of 100 years ago. And then 5 minutes later, You've got...
Oh, I've got a good one. The farewell scene between Spartacus and Sura, where he's like, lift up your dress, keep this close to your thigh, the thought of it will keep both of us warm. And her response is, kill them all. And I'm like, romance at its finest.
I can't take it seriously.
I mean, yeah. I think, it's trying to do too many things at once. It wants to be that kind of shocking, toxic masculinity. On the other hand, it wants to tell a historical story fairly accurately. On the other hand, I mean, some of the gladiatorial stuff, they've thrown in so much detail, so much accurate jargon, for instance.
Yeah.
The costumes, the armature is pretty authentic, but they kind of can't decide whether they want to be an accurate show or a shocking show, a highbrow show, or the lowest of brows show. And it just, it feels like it had too many people kind of pulling in different directions. And I think that's where it's failed, is that they didn't have like a sensible, here's what this show is.
Yeah. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and I have a little bit of a overview of the season as best as I could keep it.
I can't wait.
And then I also have like a couple of references from the historical sources, so we can kind of see what information that, because at the end of the day, what's interesting about Spartacus and what we know about a lot of historical figures is like he's almost a blank slate. You can do a lot with him.
You can do a lot. It's so true.
They sure did. So Spartacus was played by Andy Whitfield in this season. We'll probably talk about this more, but he was only in season 1 due to having cancer, and he eventually succumbed to it, so he was not able to reprise his role in the later seasons. In fact, the prequel was made in order to delay in hopes that he would recover and get to return to the show. He only plays Spartacus for season 1, and it starts with him. He's a Thracian, supposedly of one of the nomadic tribes in that region, who's serving in a Roman legion, and he ends up disobeying a legatus's commands because the legatus wants to go fight Mithridates, where all the glory is. And it was kind of nice for once to hear like a name that you don't often hear in these historical dramas. You're like, oh, Mithridates, yeah, good night.
I know that guy.
Yeah. So as a result, he is captured naked with his wife and enslaved. His wife, I don't think it really says this, but she is like a priestess basically, and her name's Sura.
Where was that? Why is she a priestess? What?
Okay, I've got that. So the reason she sees, she's kind of an oracle. She talks about the gods speak to her in dreams and all of that. I don't think they officially call her a priestess, but that is actually what the Roman sources say about her.
Weird.
Interestingly enough. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll come back to that. Spartacus is taken to the ludus of Batista, who was played by John Hannah, which was really fun, actually.
He's Jonathan. I can't see him as anything other than Jonathan from The Mummy, but continue.
Yeah. And his wife, Lucretia, which was a surprise. That is like Lucy Lawless, who, for this month of Women's History Month, we're also going to drop an episode about Xena Warrior Princess. So the stark change there from Xena to Lucretia, and it's different. It's not necessarily bad. Lucretia was one of...
Girls got range.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And all those hair colors she's pulling off, I'm like, yes.
Yes.
Blonde, red, I can't decide.
Someone has been watching Attia's wigs from Rome.
Yes.
Yep. The machinations of Batiatus and Lucretia to rise in the ranks of Roman society in their little small town of Capua leads to a lot of bloodshed and death, like so much. I couldn't even just try to cover it all in this little description. As a result of that, Spartacus, in the meantime, is learning how to be a gladiator through his interactions with the the doctore, my document corrected that, Enomaus, who is the Persian messenger from 300. Like, he immediately looked recognizable.
Yep.
That's played by Peter Menza. A very typical conniving slave, like of the Roman ilk description, in Asher, played by Nick E. Tarabe. His main rival, Crixus, who I loathe so much, played by Manu Bennett, and then his best bro bud, Varro, played by Jay Courtney. Those are just a few of many names. I'm trying to be better about knowing the actors' names, but henceforth I'll end up referring to a lot of character names going forward.
That's fine.
Yeah. And then in terms of the historical notes, so I did pull up, I have like
look
nice
at you.
Spartacus
Yes.
book. I know, I did research. So here's just a few details we have about Spartacus and his background, and it's kind of interesting to see how they worked this into the show. First comes from Plutarch. Spartacus was a Thracian born among a pastoral nomadic people. He not only possessed great spirit and bodily strength, but he was more intelligent and nobler than his fate, and he was more Greek than his Thracian background might indicate, because, Romans love to talk up their enemies after they're dead.
I was like, that's so Plutarch. Okay.
Yep.
It's most Plutarch thing ever.
Right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. People tell the following story about him. When he was brought to Rome to be sold as a slave, while he was sleeping, a snake coiled up around his head. Spartacus's wife, a woman, that's all we know about her, who came from the same tribe as Spartacus, was a prophetess who was, she's a prophetess, not a priestess. That's my fault. Who was possessed by ecstatic frenzies that were part of the worship of the god Dionysus. And like, where was that? That would have been more fun.
Nowhere, but okay.
She declared that this was the sign of a tremendous and fearsome power that would bring him to an unfortunate end. She was living with him at the time and ran away with him when he escaped. So she supposedly actually survived initially, according to Plutarch.
Well, it's funny that they do have like the snake imagery is still what she tells him, right? Like the red serpent.
They did their
research.
Plutarch.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the initial revolt, this is what Appian had to say. At about the same time, at the city of Capua in Italy, gladiators were being trained to fight in spectacles. Spartacus, a Thracian whom the Romans had imprisoned and then sold to be trained as a gladiator, had once fought as a soldier for the Roman army. He persuaded about 70 of the enslaved men to risk a break for freedom rather than to allow themselves to be put on display for the entertainment of others. And then using force to overcome the guards, the men made their escape. The fugitives armed themselves with wooden clubs and daggers that they seized from travelers on the roads nearby and then rushed to take refuge on Mount Vesuvius. Many fugitive slaves and even some freemen from the surrounding countryside came to this place to join Spartacus. And they say they began to stage bandit raids on nearby settlements. Spartacus had his fellow gladiators, Enamos and Crixus, so we know they're important, as his two subordinate commanders. Since Spartacus divided the profits of his raiding into equal shares, he soon attracted a very large number of followers, hence the communism that comes into it. So those are some details, and I will say the show ran with it. They did their bare minimum research because, again, he's mostly a blank slate, and they ran with it.
Yeah, and you can fill in a lot on the blank slate. But for this series specifically, where it is all inside the ludus, the amount of detail that they managed to cram in makes it the most authentic display of gladiatorial combat out of any cinematic or TV screen depiction of gladiatorial combat. So they've chosen, again, to focus very, very much on a certain few things to get those absolutely right. And then the rest of it, they kind of just go buck wild. It's an interesting mix.
Yeah. I do like, just from a character development perspective, if we can even call it this, that they set up Crixus and Dottore as enemies in the beginning, and the whole first season is kind of how they kind of become friends and allies. And I think there's a lot of forethought in that narrative of we know that these characters eventually band together, and it's kind of a whole season of getting the crew together and getting the band together, which I love. And I like that tension throughout the whole series.
And then, of course, after the rebellion kicks off, they do end up going their separate ways and kind of diverging during the rebellion. So it's nice to have that kind of tension signposted from the beginning. Yes, they are friends, but they don't agree on everything.
Yeah.
So let's not be surprised later on in later series when they kind of go their separate ways. Yeah. So it's incredibly clever to think about all of this in advance.
Yeah. But I feel like that's so discordant with just some like bad shit crazy stuff that happens. Like I'm thinking of the first episode when like the row of Thracians are like brought into the big fancy house and there's just like naked girls thrashing in the water in the little impluviums. And I'm like, what is happening?
Yeah, because every Roman, you didn't want beautiful art. You wanted some naked girls, with moist boobs.
A lot of nipple piercings too happening.
Yes, a surprising amount of nipple piercings. It's like, what?
I can't find that attested in any of the sources.
I think that they would have mentioned it too, right?
But you have to admit, there's as many dicks as there are boobs.
I literally have that in my notes.
Yep.
Where is it? I think I said.
So at least it's kind of equal, kind of.
Yeah. Because this is wholly for the male gaze. Those dicks are not for women. Those dicks are for men.
Yep.
They are. Okay, that was one of the scenes that just got me. It was like, I don't know, let's just have all of the potential gladiators that Alithia could buy. It's like, show them their junk.
Why not?
I'm convinced.
Why not? I love academia in a way, because I read an edited volume on Spartacus, and there is one chapter just about how frequently they get their cocks out and how it's a parallel for their swords. And I'm thinking, this is what I need to do with my life. I need to be able to watch a TV series and write a serious academic piece about how their cocks are swords. Yes, this is my calling.
Yep.
And the thing is, like, the Varro and Spartacus sharing a moment peeing off the cliff.
Yeah.
Guy bros do that. I think we should talk about audience before we get too far into it. I did want to ask Alexandra, can you give us some more details just about like gladiatorial spectacles and like the inner workings of a ludus? Because you've alluded to how like the show actually does a good job of portraying that more so than probably most modern media has done so far.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, Ridley Scott's Gladiators spent a little bit of time in ludus, not that much.
Not much. Mm-mm.
This one, it is in the ludus. Every episode is kind of a bottle episode as well, the Gladiators concept. And I think what this show does that others haven't done is show it as this huge machine that has so many working parts. So you've got the medical personnel, you've got cooks, you've got the slaves that clean, you've got the girls that work, you've got all of this is happening behind the scenes. None of this is going to be seen by the spectators, but it is absolutely how a ludus would work. And it shows how complex this system was. And I think what this series also does very well is communicate that gladiators were investments, and that if you could prove to your owner that you could give him a return on that investment, that he would begin to value you and you would get a better lifestyle. I think that was made very clear. Because, I mean, we know, don't we, that the perception is that gladiators were dying all of the time. You went out and you had a 50-50 chance, right? Well, it's not true. We've got gravestones. There's a gravestone in Greece of this gladiator who says he fought 50 times, which is an insane amount. We know in Rome chariot racing was happening, a couple of days a week, right? But spectacle was happening maybe once or twice a year. So 50 fights is an insane career. So we know that there are gladiators who are having long careers, and that can only happen if you're not dying half of the time. So the estimate is you had between maybe a 1 in 5 to a 1 in 10 chance of dying. That's pretty low, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, the rookies, their odds might have been a bit worse. But with Spartacus specifically, you can tell that Batista doesn't exactly like the guy, but he recognises that he is a solid investment. He knows that he's going to be a crowd draw and he's going to rise up the gladiatorial ranks. And what we know is that the gladiatorial ranks, later on at least, because Spartacus does seem to show the ludus perhaps in a more advanced stage than we know it would have been at the time.
Yeah.
But the gladiatorial ranking system, when the pricing came in, you charged more for your more your more talented, the celebrity gladiators. So yeah, absolutely, Batiatus doesn't like the guy, but he's seeing dollar signs every time he looks at him. And you can see that Spartacus gets shown more respect and he gets better food. And I think at one point, doesn't he move into a nicer cell as well?
Yep.
So I think what this show does, more so than anything I've ever seen, is show the kind of business aspect of it and the fact that it wasn't just a couple of guys fighting each other. It was a huge, huge machine, a huge business with many, many cogs and moving parts. That it does very well. And it kind of goes more to showing why perhaps you might be unhappy in that kind of environment when you're seen that way. I mean, we know Spartacus was famously unhappy in the ludus.
It doesn't, like, based on the sources, it sounds like he wasn't actually even in there for that long. Like, if he wasn't separated from his wife, and he's like, I don't want to be put on display. It sounds like he might have been relatively a short time.
Well,
I mean, and in this show, I think only a year passes, right?
We do know that gladiators could have wives, and we know this because there are so many epitaphs that say, I am putting up this, my husband died in a fight, this is his name, this is my name. So we do know that they could have wives. We don't really know where they would have lived, and I think this would have largely depended on the ludus and the lanista. Are they going to let the wives live with them? Are you going to spend most of your times in the cells and go, visit them on holidays and that kind of thing? So he could have been there for a short time, but the fact that he's got the wife doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't there for an extended period of time.
Yeah. I also like that it was showing how different individuals had different motivations for fighting. So, like, Spartacus was left no choice. He's a war prisoner and was just seen as like, you're a talented fighter though, so like we'll tame you, right? That's that whole thing. And you have Varro, who is in major gambling debt, so he more or less goes into this knowing it's probably one of the most profitable ways to, as an enslaved person, make money and buy his freedom back and get his family out of debt. And then there's like the careers, right? There's Crixus and Enemas that like have no ambition to ever leave.
Right.
They are there for life. It's in their blood. They don't want anything else.
Yeah, that's the other thing that I think it does well. And this again goes back to the epitaphs. We have this whole thing about the gladiatorial infamia, that they are the lowest of society's low, alongside funeral directors and sex workers and dancers and theatre actors. And the assumption, therefore, is society saw them as the lowest of the low, therefore they must have felt a lot of shame. We don't see this from the evidence that they left behind. We see this from the elite writers writing about them, right?
Yeah.
So we do get, particularly in the East, where the writing is a bit more florid, but we do get writing saying, I'm proud of myself, I'm proud of my career, I'm a hero in the arena, aren't I great? So again, this kind of series is one of the first that shows, yes, you could be someone thrown in there who hates every minute of it, but there were people for whom this was the career that they wanted, the career that they chose, and that you could thrive and be perfectly happy with it. As for Varro signing up, we know that this was happening all the time, and it kind of increases. So in this period, maybe he would absolutely have been in the minority as an auxiliary signing himself away. By the imperial period, about half of gladiators were auxiliary. So, this isn't shown. Ridley Scott had, 3 hours? He didn't show much of that at all.
Yeah.
But this one, which on the surface of it is just tits and swords, manages to go underneath the skin of the ludus far more than the ultra-serious Ridley Scott movie did. So, again, it's really weird. It's such a paradox of a show.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting to think about as a whole, and why Spartacus's story, I think, is really interesting to think about, is like, this is a story being told from a slave perspective, like, which archaeologists and historians have only now started to scratch the surface of what those lives were like.
Yeah.
They have just been, infame for so long that it's really interesting to think of a show. It's like Rome is cool because it's like that's from the commoner perspective, like the Roman commoner, which again, not a lot of scholars were thinking about, but at least it wasn't, we spent a lot of time Domina. It's like we are neck deep in the crazy first emperor's family.
Yeah.
And this is from slave perspective. And with like the few exceptions of like, it's also just like a really interesting representation of the household, right? Like what does the relationship look like between the domina and the dominus?
Yes.
And the freed persons working in his service and the slaves working in his service. And like that was fascinating. It was, and I think in a lot of ways, really well done.
Yeah. Well, I like that it is so much from the enslaved perspective that like it's no question that like Jonathan, Batianus, whatever, and Lucy Lawless are like the bad guys. Like they are like briefly maybe you feel like a little bit of sympathy for them, but they are the antagonists. They are very solidly the villains throughout the whole thing. And you're kind of happy when they get their comeuppance in the end. And it's like, yeah, we're not viewing this from the elite perspective. We're very much on the side of the slaves.
And I think that follows quite clearly on from the communist tradition of Spartacus as the communist hero, right?
Yes.
And I think the problem with the 1960 film was the fact that it had been adapted from a 1951 Howard Fast novel, Communist in Prison, American Prison. Then Trumbo wrote the script, American Communist, on the blacklist. And the network executives were so terrified of having an overtly communist film that their reaction was to completely excise everything from Spartacus's life that showed him as a credible threat to Rome. So they removed all of his military victories. They removed nearly everything, right? They had to show him to fail. It was honourable, but he had to fail. And then that kind of ruined Spartacus for a long time. The whole Marxist tradition of Spartacus was kind of stopped dead in its tracks. And it only kind of really comes back with Starz, which, considering it's got that fascist 300 kind of sepia aesthetic, when you look at the characterization of the Romans, every single one of them is an asshole.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's the enslaved people that are honourable because, they want freedom. But there's not there's a couple of the people in the Ludus that aren't exactly great people, so that you have a little bit of antagonism between themselves.
Yeah.
But every single Roman in this, you do want them to be cut down.
Yes.
So in 1960, they had to get rid of everything from the novel and the script that had Spartacus saying that he wanted to fully abolish slavery, for instance. In this series, you've got him saying, I'm going to march to Rome and we're getting rid of slavery for everybody. Not particularly historical, perhaps. This is something that, the left have kind of grafted onto Spartacus because they can, because he is that blank slate.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that all of these decades later, they're kind of re-imbuing him with this socialist ideal, whilst making him look as fascist as possible.
Well, I do think it's also interesting that Spartacus becomes, even through this characterization, kind of the reluctant leader in much like the Ridley Scott Gladiator way. Like for so much of this season, he's just like, I just want to get my wife back and then I'm out. And then I'm like busting out of here, or I'm like, I'm going to get my freedom and I'm out and I'm gone. And he doesn't really have much of a care for the other slaves for a while. I think he's like the whole situation where he's like imagining his escape and he's like killing people and like fighting his own like friends to get out the gate with his wife. And like none of that ends up happening. But for a while, I feel like he is like the individualistic kind of, I'm going to get myself out and I only care about what happens to me. And it's like only toward the end where you can kind of see he's like, my friends can actually help me with this. And like he does have that moment of, hey, maybe Crixus could help me actually escape.
Yeah, strength in numbers, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of my thought though, is like at the end of the day though, it's like I don't necessarily see him as a leader. in this season, because like at the end, it's like all he really cares about is killing, now I'm going to say Batista, which is not correct. Gladiators, right? And like all of a sudden there's just a few people who recognize his motivation and that could be to their advantage. And he's likewise looking at certain people and be like, you can get me, you can literally put your shield on the ground so I can leap up onto the balcony and kill that motherfucker. Because like, and that's kind of it at the end, right? Like we don't have Spartacus, the military leader. We have the guy who got his revenge with a little help from his friends.
And I think, when you think about men who are living in that situation where their job is to kill and quite often kill each other, a lot of research has been done that suggests that in cities where there was only one ludus, who are you going to fight? You will have to kill each other one day. So they're living in this strange world where they're bunkmates who will one day have to end each other's lives. Perhaps they have it right in thinking that these guys aren't going to be united. It's going to be, what can I get out of this if I join it? And it's not going to be some kind of concerted effort on the group's part. It's going to be individuals saying, okay, well, I can stay here and potentially die, or I can potentially die the other way, but at least it'll be on my terms, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe it was cobbled together.
Yeah. Well, I feel like it feels more realistic. Like it feels very human, right? In a surprising way. Like I keep being surprised by like the little nuggets of things that I find in this show, because I like how you said, Alexandra, it's just boobs and swords or tits and swords. But like, I feel like that their motivations sometimes feel very human and very real.
Yeah.
Well, and I was going to say that, some of this hasn't changed, right? If you think of professional sports and the way that hazing is a very common thing in professional sports, because at the end of the day, you are in fact competing for 5 spots on a basketball court, or 1 spot, 11 spots on a football team or something like that, right?
Yeah.
It's cutthroat and like people are nasty to each other. I've heard stories about graduate programs where like if there's funding on the line, people will hide books from each other to like for an exam or something they need.
Jesus.
Because it's just that cutthroat when money is involved. So when your life is on the line and money's involved.
And assuming that all of their lives are going to be cut short unnaturally. Your life in the ludus, as it is, maybe that extra serving of food that you get because you're 1 rank higher than the guy next to you, that 1 extra bowl of gruel will be enough motivation for you to stab him in the back. Well, I mean, stabbing him in the front, technically. It would be a highly competitive atmosphere because of those carrots being dangled in front of you to be the best so that you can earn your own the most. And it all comes back absolutely to money and your value.
Yeah, I will say that was one of my favorite scenes from his fever dream, was like he's looking at his wound that has festered and the coins start spilling out. And I'm like, I like that. Cool. Good job.
That was nice. Yeah, I did like that.
I did just want to comment on, because a lot of people pan the slow motion, the blood splatter was ridiculous, like to an extent. But there were some really interesting scenes in the like Zack Snyder and the 300 style of things that were really well done. And it was usually when like Spartacus was actually dreaming or like having flashbacks to his wife as a prophetess and things like that. So it's like, I think it could have been used effectively sometimes, and other times it was just overkill.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. And I think, again, that's a large part of it is down to clearly what the network executives wanted from it.
Yeah.
But also they were writing their script for one kind of audience, and the cinematography was for the polar opposite audience.
Yes.
To try and get both. And I mean, if you listen to the soundtrack with all of the guitars, you know, the metal, that's very 300-y.
Absolutely.
And then on the other hand, some of them are talking as if they've, stepped out of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Like what?
So that brings me to like the conversation I wanted to have about audience. So I actually want to start with the Roman audience of Spectacle, right? Oh, Alexandra is cringing so hard right now. Because I mean, and I think it's important to like think of like a modern day equivalent. And part of me is like, if it was super popular American football would be something that we would think of as really equivalent because it is still pretty violent. But we still have blood sports today too. We have MMA fighting, or, you know, we have professional wrestling too, if you want the more stylized violence that still results in serious injury and death sometimes. And, you know, depending on which one of those we would compare most to the gladiatorial games, it's like the audience narrows down further as you go to the extreme of violence, I feel like. So, you know, my question is like, who is actually entertained by these games? When Maximus asks, are you not entertained? Who is entertained by it?
Okay, and again, this is where I think Spartacus beats Maximus into a pulp. Because, I mean, in Gladiator, I counted at one point when Maximus is in the arena at Zuckerbar, he goes through, I think, 6 or 8 gladiators in half a minute, which is insane. Because as we know, these are all, I'd say, mid-level gladiators. They're in a province, so they're not going to be top tier, but they're going to be expensive guys. The editor of the games rents out the gladiators, and if they die, he has to essentially pay for their full worth rather than just the rental price. So what Maximus is doing is cutting down half a dozen mid-tier guys. This is going to be too expensive, especially for half a minute. We know from tests that have been done with reenactments that a good match could probably take 10 to 15 minutes. So what Spartacus does well, which Gladiator didn't, was show what the Romans appreciated about gladiatorial combat, because it wasn't just about seeing as much blood as possible. What they wanted to see was the prevention of the spilling of blood. They were looking at tactics and the skill set and, you know, bobbing and weaving, getting out of the way. So technically, they weren't there to see blood. They were there to see people working as hard as they could with their brains and their muscles to prevent seeing that blood. And I think that's what they do well here, because they show that the gladiators are evenly matched. I don't think any of the fights, particularly in my memory, were cut short too much. It showed you that these guys were going toe-to-toe, and that it wasn't a walk in the park like it is for Maximus, just going, you know, absolutely nuts. And that, I think, is something that we don't look at enough when we think about what were the Romans getting out of this. And this is, again, they've got such a contrast, because they've got accurate armature, they've got accurate, as far as we can tell, tactics and moves and all of that. And on the other hand, instead of an audience that's looking at this and appreciating the skill, you've got an audience. I mean, some of the women are getting so into it that they can't tell that their dress has fallen off.
Just straight up topless.
And they're so turned on, they're just having sex in the stands too. Like,
yeah, right. So it's this discordant. They're showing what the Romans would have appreciated, but they're not showing the Romans appreciating what they should be appreciating.
Yeah.
I think, you know how when people are like watching a sports game, and my husband does this with rugby. He's a huge rugby fan. He used to play when he was younger. And he will watch a match now and say, why didn't you do it this way? That guy's in the wrong place.
Yep.
You know, going through it, and he's critiquing every single move that these guys are making. That's what they should have the Romans in the stands doing. They should be looking, oh, that guy's defensive stance could be stronger. That guy's not using his weapon to its utmost effect. That guy's shield should be closer to his body. He's leaving too much skin exposed. That's what they should have. They should have a bunch of really anal guys watching them saying, I could do that better, because... I mean, the best way I can describe it is the way I watch Great British Bake Off.
Oh, yeah.
Because I'm crap at baking cakes. I'm a good cook, but cakes, no. And I'll watch it and go, oh, that Genovese sponge. Ooh. Really? I've never used Genovese sponge in my life. I use Betty Crocker mixes, but I will critique it. And this is what I mean. Yeah. You're watching a couple of people who think they can do it better because, you know, they've watched it a couple of times. That's what they should have that audience doing, as far as I'm concerned.
I love that.
And instead, they fall back on the stereotype of all Romans were bloodthirsty, mindless morons, and it wasn't that at all.
Yeah.
It was a demonstration of the utmost skill.
Yeah.
And, yeah. I feel they put so much emphasis on getting some things right. It made it really weird to me that they made that so wrong.
So I'm really into football, soccer. I'm into soccer, football more. And like, dude, I've been to a game in Greece where after the match, the SWAT police had to come in because chairs were being thrown, and during the match, like the like super fans, they have flares in the stands.
Oh my
God. Like everyone knows chants, right? Like, and as Alexandra said, it's like your critique. Like, if I watch soccer, because I played my whole life up through high school, I will critique people. It's like, what are you doing? I watched the Women's World Cup, and I'm like, what are you doing?
What are you
Coach,
doing?
What are you doing? What decisions are you making? Why are you letting that person do this?
Yeah.
So, like, I am there on that level to an extent. And it's like you can create a really interesting spectatorship without just chaos. So much chaos.
Yeah. And it's so hypocritical of them as well, because they've made a point of making their CGI violence so graphic, which they are making for us to enjoy, but then the internal spectators are mindless morons. So are they trying to tell us that we are mindless morons for watching the same violence as the spectators?
I feel a little bit like a mindless moron.
Yes, that is what I feel after watching this series. A little bit like a mindless moron.
Because they get the details that they do get right so right, and even down to, terminology that they don't need to put in. It's only really there for hardcore historian nerds to go, I know that word, It's really only there as Easter eggs for people like us. This is the deep problem that I have with this, is that they had the chance to do something great, and they decided not just to go with the lowest common denominator, but that they were trying to go for both.
Yeah. So I pulled one review because I do want to, since Alexandra has wonderfully steered us in the direction of what about the modern audience? What are they getting from it? Here is one 10 out of 10 review that I pulled.
Okay.
And it is titled "Potentially the Man's Man Fantasy Series." Any die-hard beer swigging UFC watching 300 special edition owner that loves swords, blood, action, fighting, boobs, booty, etc. will eventually come to love this show.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
The pilot was just an introductory, and although it may not be worthy of a 10, I think it has only been reviewed by women who I can understand may not love this series, or people who generally don't like this type of movie. Really, I don't know what's the point of watching something if you can't stand that genre. But anyway, that's me.
I hate this man.
So in conclusion, I have high hopes for the future of this series. I may have gave it a much higher score than I felt the opening episode deserved, but I felt the need to counter the low reviews that have thus far been posted. It is well worth watching as the action intensifies in the following weeks, and the sex, which is going to be a huge appeal for most men, it is very near softcore porn, but with a realistic feel to it.
I mean, 2010, but you could find free porn on the internet if you wanted,
right?
As a matter of fact, the sex scenes that I have saw are much more believable and sexy than most XXX movies. So there you go, your price of admission right there.
Oh, God.
I feel so gross.
It is people like that reviewer that make me uncomfortable in focusing on spectacle, because I feel like I'm constantly having to say, look, I'm not a misogynist, I'm not a fascist, I'm not racist, I'm not any of these things, even though I'm talking about this stuff. I mean, it's interesting because, again, they're quite clearly trying to reel in these bros.
Yes.
On the other hand, though, I mean, gladiatorial stories for the last 70 years on screen have had issues with race. Claire Greenhalgh has done a great chapter on Swords and Sandals specifically, where she talks about the fact that the 1960 film Civil Rights Movement and how they dealt with Drabba was perhaps revolutionary for the time, but because the film was so iconic, every single homage since has kind of fallen into the 1960s race trap instead of moving on a bit. It's quite clear that the Starz ludus is the most ethnically diverse of all the ludus on Swords and Sandals movies, on where it's bled into other genres. This one is most ethnically diverse, so that's a big tick. It's still got a few race issues, but it's better than other ones. So big tick on the woke list. It is the only gladiatorial story in any genre on screen that has queer relationships. Big tick on the woke list.
Yeah.
It's one of the only ones that have ancient women having any agency. And actually, some of the women in this have more agency than modern dystopian gladiators like Katniss Everdeen.
Yeah.
Because she was essentially manipulated into everything she did. Some of the women in this show much more critical thinking and agency. So again, it's not feminist. I'm not going to call it feminist.
No. We'll get into it. It's like agency, yes, but with a male bent to it, for sure.
It's male gaze, definitely.
Yeah.
However, it's not as misogynistic. So it could have been a lot worse. And in other ways, within the gladiatorial kind of narratives that you see springing up across multiple genres, it does a better job than most. Tick, tick, tick on the woke list. If your standards are quite low, which let's face it, they are, because it's TV, especially 2010. Wow. So standards are quite low, and they still manage to meet them. So they're drawing in the trad bros, whilst kind of Trojan horsing in the idea of happy, equal queer relationships, which no doubt happened in the ludus. I imagine that there was a whole lot of it.
Sure.
Because as we know, I mean, ancient sexuality is nothing like modern sexuality. I have no doubt that these men spending waking out with each other must have at some point looked at each other and, oh yeah, you're fine.
Is that not why we have them in the locker room with the strigils and oil?
Yeah. I mean, everyone talks about the homoeroticism of football changing rooms, right? This must have been that on steroids.
Absolutely.
And we know that there were black gladiators. For instance, there's a vase came out of Rome in Britain, from Colchester, that has a gladiatorial fight scene depicted on it, and one of them is called Memnon, who, as we know, Ethiopian king from myth. So we think that was his stage name because of his skin tone. He's saying, I am a mythical king from Africa, and he won his fight. We know that from the context of the vase that it was probably depicting a real fight, a commemorative item from a particularly popular and thrilling fight that would have been talked about for years afterwards. So 99% sure that this guy existed. So we know that Gladiators weren't as white as other films might suggest. I mean, I know Gladiator had Juba, but
Gladiator also got one other thing right, in that it presented female gladiators in one of the fights, which we know also is historically accurate.
This is one of my hot button topics. We've got one piece of art from Turkey, which is one piece of art. We've got, out of all the mentions in Roman historians, most of them are talking about women appearing in the arena isn't specific enough. So most of the time it appears that most of them were hunters, or they might even have been dancers and musicians. A lot of them weren't there of their own volition. A lot of them were thrown in because they were the wives of senators and emperors were crazy. So I'm not going to call them gladiators.
I mean, they're gimmicky, right? Like whatever woman you throw in the arena is a gimmick. So like an Amazon maybe, or
Amazon and Achillea. It's a cute story. And there's an inscription from Ostia that says women with swords. But again, it's not overly clear what's happening there. So I think it's safe to say that there would have been a couple of fights with female gladiators, but the point of the gladiatorial spectacle was a celebration of masculinity. I'm not sure we should consider female gladiators to be even popular with some audiences because of the masculine context.
Sure.
I think many of them would have seen it as a transgression of a kind. You know, you can't show that women can do exactly what the men do, otherwise they'll want to do it all the time.
Not unless they die at the end, right? Like at the end of the day.
Yeah, if they get cut in half, that's fine. It just proves that they shouldn't be there, right? So we know that there were a couple of female gladiators, but I think we need to be ultra cautious about how many.
Yeah, that's fair. So we've been talking a lot about the male gaze, and I do want to like highlight some of the moments of like actual misogyny that is in here.
Yeah.
Well, and some of the other motifs that go into a lot of media that is attracting Chad Bro types. One thing I thought was interesting is there's a level of stoicism here as well, because the best gladiators are often sober. I think Ina Mouse is the best example of this, right? Does not partake in women. So Spartacus does this for the longest time after his wife. And Crixus is kind of on the other one, right? Like he is almost undone by the amount of sex with all of the women that he is having. Side note, Crixus is the most desired one of the entire Ludus. All the women want him? No. I don't care if he's champion. Ew.
If he'd have had a different haircut, I think it would have. It's the hair.
It's really the hair.
It really was. I'm glad we're all in agreement on that. It's just no.
They did him a disservice with that hair.
I will say at the end of the day, Ina Mouse is probably the only man in that entire series that I'm like, I think I like you. Everyone else I've got like some beef with. To some extent, there are extremes. Like Varro doesn't seem that bad, right? He's best buds to Spartacus. His whole initial interaction with his wife of like, she telling him she was raped.
Yeah.
And calls her a whore and says, oh, you know, if you truly loved me, blah, 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 you would have fought him off. And then she proceeds to do it the next time she's almost raped. And I'm like, no.
I mean, it would be interesting, wouldn't it, to see how many writers in that writer's room were female identifying.
You know, there was an interesting thing in that I think the producer was a woman. Let me double check that real quick.
Interesting. Well, doesn't Spartacus also like give Varro shit for being a dick about it? Yeah. Right? He's. I mean, like I feel like they do. I hated this storyline also, but I feel like they do try to call out like why are you acting this way? This is ridiculous. But I feel like it's there to cause tension, and I feel like it was an unnecessary.
Yeah, it's causing tension before he gets, you know, unceremoniously killed off.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. So I'm looking at the writing credits, and I see a lot of names. There's 1, 2, 3. There's like 4 writers like that are at least have female names. I shouldn't presume, but like. Yeah, it's interesting because I think that's where we do get some of that agency we see in the women that we like. Like, I like Lucy Lawless's Lucretia. I like to hate her. And I will say that for me, the most problematic relationship that I saw was the relationship between Alithea and Lucretia. Because to me, that was the male gaze imagining of female relationships, female friendships, right? It is Mean Girls, cutthroat undermining with nice pretty faces on the front of it. It's a toxic relationship. It's like, I've never been long engaged in any kind of friendship or relationship with anyone that was like that.
Yeah, no.
And their machinations against each other for me were like some of the biggest plot twists that happened. Lucretia setting up the night with Spartacus and then Alithea.
Oh yeah, he's painted gold and everything. Yeah, that was a scene that I won't forget fairly soon.
It's like, oh god, no.
So we've got that one, and then what was another? So and then like Alithea sleeping with Numerius.
Gross.
Which is problematic because that is also presented as the male fantasy, right? Of like a young boy all of a sudden gets his first night with a hot woman
who knows what she's doing,
just so she can get what she wants out of him.
Yeah. So gross.
And that results in like some of these moves between these women all over Crixus and Spartacus, basically. And I think that's where I say it's like the motivations behind it makes no sense to me in terms of like they would, you know, what is really Alithea's motivation against Spartacus? Oh, you kind of humiliated my husband, but if she's as vapid as they try to make her look, she's not working that hard to ruin Spartacus's life.
Yeah, no, because he's a slave and she doesn't give a shit, right?
And Lucretia's possessiveness of Crixus.
It all goes back into the titillation, doesn't it? The feeling that this is the male fantasy. I've got a woman who's so obsessed with me that she will murder and scheme just to have 15 minutes with me in a cell. And this kind of sexual interaction, it isn't actually deeply problematic. This is what I wanted when I was 14. This is the kind of thing that I was looking up on the internet back in the days of dial-up. It's so male, isn't it? It's just so very...
The scene that really clinched it for me was after it's revealed that Alethea and Spartacus are the ones that have, and then I forget the other blonde's name.
Yeah, I forgot her name.
Yeah.
Alethea's whole reason for attacking her is that she's being laughed at. That is not the female fear.
No, that's the male
that is
fear.
What men fear is to be laughed at.
I mean, that whole thing. I mean, first of all, with the gold paint, all I could think of was that's going to be a UTI,
right?
There's that. And also, they're both wearing masks. I'm sorry. There's not a lot of fun foreplay happening if you're both stuck behind masks.
So
well,
true.
Again, that's a very male thing, isn't it? Why do you need to have foreplay? We're ready to go at any second, right? Yeah. So she's just supposed to have had the night of her life. Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense to me. It's four female writers. Where were you?
They weren't on those episodes, probably.
I guess not.
They're not on every episode. But I mean, that's just it too. Is like, why does Alethea have anything to fear on the same level as the other blonde who's just as naked as her, ready to hook up with the gladiator?
Yeah.
Why does she fear the threat of her having knowledge that she hooked up with Spartacus? Because like she was about to do the same thing.
Yeah.
They're in the same social position. They have like the same level of power over each other in that regard.
And they're for the same reason. Yeah, exactly. They can blackmail each other about it. They're both there for the same reason. Yeah. She's worried about them telling the husband. Tell her husband.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. No, that made very little sense.
And it kind of hinged on everything. Like that's how they got the patronage, right? Is like basically revealing that Alethea is the one who killed the girl.
Chick, yeah.
And so the other comparable one was when Aurelia, Varro's wife, kills Numerius. But that one to me was believable because, like, you know, here's this young, rich guy saying, like, he was nothing. And she's like, you don't know who he was and what he meant to me. Her wrath and her rage, I understand.
Yes, that made
As
sense.
a motivation.
Oh, absolutely.
That made a lot more sense. And that was very satisfying, actually.
It was. Yeah. No, it's like, Aurelia, I get. Yeah. Alethea makes no sense.
And again, because like Alethea, she's aristocratic Roman, right? The slave girl isn't. But she's the one that has morals and moral compass and justified rage. But because Alethea is Roman and the Romans are all villain coded in this, it's very black and white.
Yeah.
Therefore, she has to be crazy. It's disappointingly shallow.
It is because she's both vapid. Like, she is the vapid blonde, right? Of, like, judging other people based on, you know, your hair, your jewelry, your blah, blah, blah. But, you know, master scheming level of things at the same time. Like, of all the people I expected to walk out of the Ludus that night surviving,
not her.
I don't know if Alethea was top of the list, but I'm not surprised either. Asher? Yeah, Asher is Iago to me. Like, that is straight up Shakespeare Iago type of character right there.
He's such an unlikable character. It never fails to shock me that they're going to centre an entire series around the guy that no one likes.
I know. I was like, why him? He was awful, and I hated him, and I was glad when he dies, right?
This is the whole Coriolanus Snow all over again.
Yeah,
right?
it is.
Yes, it is.
It is. Are we going to try to redeem him or just let him continue to just fall into, oh, yeah, that's why I don't like you?
If we talk about what happened after the rebellion, I mean, at the end of the final series, spoiler alert, you have the rebellion fails.
Not there yet.
6,000 people crucified along the Appian Way. Yeah, all of that tick, 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 tick.
Yeah.
But if we look at what happens after that, where Asher would be, if he wasn't in that battle, which we assume he wasn't because he left them at Vesuvius, Pompey Magnus comes in to try and one-up Marcus Licinius Crassus by rounding up anyone he can, you know, say, I think you were involved with Spartacus, so I'm going to kill you, and I get all the glory with the Senate. So this series surely will just be Asher trying not to get massacred by Pompey. I don't know, it's going to be weird.
Or like I said, if like they're smart, they'll release like one episode a week. Because if they try to do that same exact motif and release it all at once to be binged, it's just soul crushing.
Yes.
Like to watch. It's soul crushing. It's desensitizing. It's not bingeable TV.
Yeah, I think when the creators were talking about it, they suggested that they'd done some research into Roman attitudes towards violence and death, and they are indeed different from our own, and that might be why they went a similar way, because they're trying to be as authentic as possible. On the other hand, again, because they're making it so mindless most of the time, because the fights that were happening in the arena, you see some skill, but I think it's fair to say most of the deaths here are murders in this series.
Yeah.
I'd say that there's more kind of crimes of passion than there are skillful fights. So that's, at least the Romans justified it because they were watching skill.
Right.
With these throat slittings every 5 minutes, there's no skill in that. That does just go into mindless violence.
Mm-hmm. There was one other relationship I wanted to unpack because it was interesting to me, was the relationship between, and this is going to be the premise for the next season, or the prequel season, if you will, of Batiatus and Lucretia.
Yeah.
I was curious what you guys thought of that dynamic, because I kind of liked it, actually, in terms of there was an I feel like they authentically cared for each other and also had a certain respect. Like, they had similar goals. They wanted to be partners. They withheld things from each other, but there was also an understanding there. Like, Batiatus is just straight up having sex with slaves in front of his wife as a supposed turn on, and he has knowledge of her relationship with Crixus, but it only becomes problematic when it becomes publicly known. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is just he is authentically he is ecstatic that she's finally with child.
Yeah.
And he doesn't care necessarily who the father might be.
Right.
Which is really interesting. That was the interesting thing about Varro too, because I totally would have expected to be like, yeah, can you do something about that guy's child? I don't want to raise it. Like just another mouth to feed. I'm like chancing death here.
I feel like that's also like the male fantasy, though, of like stepping up to be the hero, right? Of like, I'm the best. I'm the good guy. Yeah. Like, I'm doing the right thing.
Savior
in so
complex.
Many ways. Yeah. Yes, big savior complex. But I do think it was like Lucretia thought that she was hiding her relationship with Crixus from Batiatus. And he at the end was like, what, you thought I didn't know? And like that, I was like, I wish they had just been like more open about it. But I don't know. I do like that they seemed almost equals in so many ways, at least toward the beginning. And it was like that Batiatus sort of started hiding more and more from Lucretia as you go on. And that really kind of becomes more and more a problem. And I think like the cracks forming between them are like part of what brings the whole house down around them. So I liked that was part of the larger narrative. And yeah, I guess I did like, they were both evil in their own ways, and I hated them in like different.
They're a great antagonistic couple for the series.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because the politics of their relationship isn't exactly the ancient ideal, as we know. So that's a modern grafting onto them what we want to see. On the other hand, the sexual side of their relationship, I don't think is an ancient or a modern ideal as such. Let's face it, we're still quite conservative. But when they talk about trying to show a different view on violence, yes, we are going to put so much into it that it desensitizes you because this is what we think may have happened. I don't think they're doing it the right way, but I think with the sexual relationships, they're trying to say the Romans didn't view sex the way that we did. They're showing it in a way that is absolutely wrong, but I think they are trying to show the views on things were different. So yeah, I think they're trying to show that you can separate love from sex and respect from sex,
right?
All of this, there are some beautiful relationships, some even almost romantic relationships in the show. I'm not going to say that theirs is particularly, but there is a lot of respect there. Why would you, if you're going to go to the effort of saying things were different and we're going to try and explain how, would you fudge it up quite as much? But on the other hand, would modern women sit down to watch another show where women don't have any agency and are second-class citizens in their own marriages? Would we sit down and watch that? Or do we want them to fudge it up so that we can see this woman girl boss her way into murdering everyone she doesn't like. And
yeah, which brings me the other romance. Okay, one of the best romances was Barca and Pietro, and that was tragic how that all ended.
I know,
but also
upsetting.
Probably realistic in a certain regard too. Like without Barca's protection, what Pietro might have suffered, as an individual in the Ludus, and the result of that, it's like it still really sucks that was the only really clearly gay man besides Barca. Well, and like they both have really brutal ends.
It's the whole bury your gays thing. It's such a lazy thing to fall back on.
So there's that one, and then the romance that made me laugh was Crixus and Navia. Because it starts just like, oh, I've noticed. It's like you've been around this whole time, but I noticed you've ripened, and here's a pretty necklace.
It was so gross. I know, it was so gross.
And she's like, I can't keep it. It's like, I hate you. I'm gonna go deal with the Domina now. And what was the other one? The key situation of like, I saw you touching and laughing at the guard and touching his arm, and I'm so pissed off. She's like, dude, I was getting a key so we could hook up. And like, I would be so pissed off at his accusation of that, and I'd be like, fuck you, maybe another time, and walk away. I'm not rewarding the man for accusing me of baking eyes at another man.
I mean, Crixus is as dumb as a plastic bag full of ground beef. He is just dumb. So dumb.
So dumb.
And, she kept on going back. I can only imagine why.
I can't. Yeah, that was so
Who's worse,
into
Crixus
the floor.
or Asher? They really did a poor number on that woman.
And you just know, I mean, for all they show this kind of very energetic sex, you just know she probably wasn't enjoying it that much because he's just too dumb to know what to do.
Ain't that the truth?
Like, I fight good. I make eyes at you in the balcony. This one's for you.
I can't. No.
And that was the wooing romance, right? Like, that was the wooing romance out of anything else going on.
And I think many girls still go through, right? The meathead trying to clumsily, I have feelings, you mate with me now. Yeah. Again, where were those 4 female writers? Where were they?
Where were they?
They were showing up for a few choice lines for Lucy Lawless.
I guess.
I feel like.
I mean, I think because, we've all been around academia. We all know that we're never going to make any money out of this. I reckon that what I should be doing is writing feminist gladiatorial erotica and publishing it myself on Amazon.
Yes. We've had that conversation.
We have had this conversation, yeah.
After The Lost City with Sandra Bullock and Channing Tatum.
I watched that the other week,
She's an anthropologist. And she makes money writing trashy romance novels. They were like, I think she has the right idea.
I can be Sandra
Bullock. I feel like we could do this. Guys.
This is clearly what the genre is missing, is some feminist gladiatorial just banging.
Mm-hmm.
But
I love it.
With foreplay and no gold paint, because that's just a yeast infection waiting to happen.
It's horrifying.
And that's just it. It's like, that happened, right? These are like hot male celebrities.
Yeah.
Lots of women were sleeping with them.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Lots of sexually transmitted diseases were flying around.
This goes back, doesn't it, to kind of keeping your prize fighters happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If they want to, get along, then there's an incentive for you to provide that. I love the fact that the satires mention this woman is running off with a gladiator, her husband's mega rich, but she's running off with a guy with cauliflower ears and scars everywhere, and he probably stinks. I'm thinking, well, yeah, because it all goes back to cavemen. Big man, he protects me. I can see it.
But there's not like really any thought to men aren't unpacking what actually women want out of the relationship, because financial security with a wealthy, ugly man who probably mistreats her, she has no agency with, versus hot gladiator dude who maybe is better at wooing than Crixus. Who knows?
I mean, it wouldn't take much to be better than Crixus.
Gladiators were, and they are still sexy. We know this because not only did the ancients tell us the women had to be sent up to the back row so they couldn't see them clearly enough, we've seen in loads of films, starting off before Kirk Douglas, good-looking men wearing not a lot, doing manly things. It does something to our female brains if we're heterosexual. They are sexy. I think what this series does is kind of, it relies on their sexiness just being really ripped instead of, I mean, a couple of them show some emotional depth sometimes. And again, they don't show a lot of emotional depth, but they show more emotional depth than, say, Maximus.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Because again, the bar is really low.
I will say something that's interesting too is like, I admire the gladiator male form in this show. Like Spartacus, hot.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I remember when I was first trying dating online, I looked at guys who took pictures of themselves in the gym, and I said, I don't need that in my life, because the obsession to look like that is not the amount of time I want to spend focused on my body. Because it's like, I would have, like, as a woman with a man with that body, I would have to have a certain body. I don't know if that's true necessarily, like that's shallow to say, but that is an internal presumption I am making.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a fair presumption to make given our culture.
Right.
Yeah.
I would say.
And the amount of time, it's like, I am spending more time in the gym, and I go with my partner, and it's really nice. But it's also like, there are teenage boys in there who are trying to power lift, and I'm like, you do not have the actual mature body to do things like that yet. And it's like, all of these men with these bodies in this show, they are not for us to look at and be like, well, that's hot. Like, it's a bonus if there happens to be a poor girlfriend, wife, female partner watching the show with their male partner. But those bodies are for men to enjoy.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely. We can look at them and think, yeah, it's hot. But we have the understanding that that comes with a level of dedication and sacrifice that perhaps means that tunnel vision there. It's also important to mention that I don't think this is what Gladiators would have looked like. It's an unrealistic standard. So there's not a lot of gladiatorial skeletons around. There's a couple from York, and there are a couple from Ephesus.
Yep.
But there's only two cemeteries that we found. The bones show that they were indeed highly muscled, but the osteoarchaeologists that worked on the Ephesus skeletons decided to do some isotope analysis and look at the diet involved. And they weren't eating huge amounts of meat. We know that they had a quite high amount of fish in their diet, but then again, so did everyone else in Ephesus. And they were eating a hell of a lot of grains and beans and barley and that kind of thing. So was everyone else in Ephesus. So the only dietary difference that they could tell from the civilian population was a high strontium level, which they worked out. They found a reference to an ash drink that would aid bone regeneration after traumatic injury. So these guys were drinking essentially ash smoothies to try and aid.
Not much has changed.
Right?
Well, yeah. Exactly. Time to take my supplements, boy.
Right.
The diet, it was never going to be anything too extravagant, because even though these are investments, you're not going to be wasting a lot of money on the food necessarily. You're going to give them fuel.
Right. Well, I think about Galen too, talks about like what athletes should eat. Yeah. And it's like very carb heavy. Yeah. He's like, because you want the energy like this. If you don't like eat, more than people usually do, then you're going to not perform well. Yeah. And it's like, carbs give us energy, obviously. So
all of the body types that we're seeing in this series show that it's really shredded. It's interesting that one of the Ephesus osteoarchaeologists suggested that gladiators should be obese, because he says that subcutaneous fat provided an extra level of protection against major arteries and organs. Now, I've got issues with this because
I do too.
They were eating a lot of essentially stews, and they were working throughout every day for hours, because what else was there to do? This was their job. So I don't think it was possible on that diet and that regimen to get obese in the first place. But I also don't think that they were as shredded as the guys portrayed here. Also, I don't get the whole subcutaneous fat thing, because let's face it, okay, they weren't wearing a lot, but they had the feels and they had their skill. And I've seen a gladius, and a gladius is not going to care whether you've got 5% body fat or 25%. It's not going to care.
No, it's not going to care. No.
So,
well, I also think that like the measure of obesity that we have today is based on so much modern data for modern populations eating very processed modern diets. And I think like what it's the body mass indicator, BMI, like that, the level that puts people at obesity is kind of ridiculous for people who are like bodybuilders and who have, you know, high levels of muscle, and also eat incredibly healthy, are still like technically counted as obese under some of those things. And so I kind of feel like using that metric again is not helpful. And I do agree that like the whole shredded aesthetic is something that is also very modern to us.
Galen had a word for obese that he uses elsewhere. He doesn't ever use it for gladiators. What he does say is the flesh should be firm, much like pork. So I think shredded is a modern thing. Even the most shredded of statues isn't as shredded as these guys, right?
Yep.
No. Have you ever seen the like comparison of Hugh Jackman in the first X-Men movie versus his physique in like Logan or something? And just within the span of 20 years? What the like expectations for the male physique has drastically changed.
I was reading, I was listening to Henry Cavill was talking about The Witcher and the bathtub scene.
Yes.
And he's a big guy. And he still didn't look perfect enough. So they made him drink no water for 3 days, which I thought would kill you. And apparently that makes the skin kind of suck to the muscle more to make more definition. But he said that at that point he could barely think straight. He was tired all the time. He could smell water, which I thought was strange. So if you're having people that are this shredded, it suggests that they're not going to have the energy to do this, to 10 to 15 minutes of quite complicated combat. Then they need that kind of, again, my rugby husband kind of says you've got to have the belly to take you through the 80 minutes. So I think if we're thinking about gladiatorial bodies, they've set such an unrealistic standard. I think Russell Crowe, not that they showed a lot of his body.
They just made it in the armor. Armor with they learned from the Batman movie. It's like, make the armor have abs.
So he was a big guy. He wasn't cut. I think the ideal gladiatorial body, and they really should be showing this somewhere because there's a whole expectation amongst the men watching this. They should be showing like NFL players, rugby players, the kind of guys that they're big because they're doing this work. But they're not, not so defined. They've got some meat on the bone. There's not just pure muscle. So a little bit of subcutaneous fat, maybe, just to keep the archaeologists happy.
Have you seen that picture? It's like, I want to say it's in some Hall of Fame somewhere, but it's like a cast of like a linebacker's leg, and it's like somebody standing inside of it, and it's like just this guy's leg, and it's enormous. See, they're just like big, powerful guys who are just I completely agree.
I mean, again, my husband watches a lot of rugby, and I watch it for very different reasons than he does. And you see some of these guys, and they don't look like what society tells us is the ideal male body. However, they are doing incredibly powerful stuff for 80 minutes without losing puff. That is the ideal male body for that purpose. So I think, again, with this, the show from a male perspective has probably done quite a lot of psychological damage to the people watching it. Because this body type won't serve the audience well, because they're going to really have to suffer to get it and struggle even harder to maintain it. But also it's not even it's not even ideal for the context.
Mm-mm.
It's just not ideal for anyone, really.
No.
It's just, I mean, it's the equivalent, isn't it, of having all the girls have massive boobs, tiny waists, and massive butts. It's not realistic.
Yeah.
And I know that, I mean, this is, again, my argument that I've had the whole time. They're being ultra realistic on mentioning certain terminology and having the right armature, and then on other things they're just going, let's make this as ridiculous as possible.
Yeah, it is truly a mixed bag of a show, like, because at the same time it's like all of the violence and the cutthroatness is like, but this is a story about slaves, and like that was the whole point of slavery, right? And these games, not necessarily of the gladiators, but the other spectacles of prisoners being killed and things like that, is like the point was to dehumanize, to desensitize to the violence to the point that you feel justified in these deaths happening. So you can't have true camaraderie. Like, I thought it was really interesting, for instance, that Crixus and Spartacus don't bond over their victory of Theocles. They only finally bond when Crixus has experienced the loss of a woman that he cares about, the same way Spartacus did.
Yeah.
And earlier, Crixus had made a comment. It wasn't about the woman, but it was about when Varro died by Spartacus's hand. And Crixus says, like, grieving like a woman. And yet that is ultimately, like, what plants the seed of the bond between the two of them finally. It's not their camaraderie in the arena and successfully killing the unkillable opponent. It was this shared vulnerability between them. And it's just such a weird mix of, like, it is, I feel like it's telling a good, important story because that's what slavery was and always was. That's how slavery has to function. But at the same time, in making it entertainment, it does us such a huge disservice.
Yep.
Part of me thinks that the kind of tension in the relationship between Crixus and Spartacus was, for their situation, probably the most sensible psychological thing to do, right? Because they do know that at some point, as the two top tier, they are going to have to go up against each other, and probably one will kill the other. So maybe to keep that emotional distance between each other is what you require to be able to do that job. For instance, and again, we know that this happened. We know that the people who lived with each other and trained with each other would eventually have to turn on each other. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that gladiators, particularly those who knew each other, would try as hard as they could not to deal blows that would kill, but that would, get the job done. And then we all go and visit the medic afterwards. We are aware that they were taking things like this into consideration. But maybe there is a psychological kind of feeling behind it of, I can't let myself get too close to this guy, otherwise I can't function in my role.
Yeah.
And when you look at his relationship with Varro, who he does allow himself to get closer to and open up emotionally to, and they talk about their lives and their women and their hopes and their dreams, and it's all very idyllic, and then he has to kill him. He's so upset about it that it starts him off on the path of a rebellion that will end up killing tens of thousands of people. So maybe Crixus and Spartacus were doing absolutely the right thing, keeping a healthy distance from each other. And again, we're talking about things like grad school, right? And you have to work with these people and live with them and see them every day. And I can't imagine what it's like in the back of my mind. I might have to kill him tomorrow.
Yeah. That's where I get stuck with this show too, of like, I appreciate that, like, that is the story being told, because again, those stories were ignored for so long by scholars, by media and things like that. But I literally just got to, when I said at the beginning, it's like, I found this show soul crushing to watch, like Varro's death, as well as the black man's death. It was all the new recruits. And you have that moment where, like, the new recruits are in the cell and they're having a discussion, and the black man is talking about how he actually admires Spartacus. He is something to admire and, mold yourself to. And like it had, that Shakespearean poetic aspect to it of being aspiring. And the next thing you know, he is smashed against a wall onto a hook and dead.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it is literally just meant to crush your soul. which makes sense because, you know, the question is too, is like that's something that's interesting that our media is doing that I don't think even the ancient scholars cared to ask, is like, what actually brought these people to this point that they would risk the lives, you know, that was explained really well. If Spartacus did anything to the Dominus or the Domina, all of the slaves would be killed horrifically.
Yep.
What would it take to make someone risk that for an open rebellion, which we know historically happened? And should we make a show about it?
Yeah, that's again, maybe, should we even be making this story? I don't know.
Let's face it, Plutarch wrote about it because he was writing in the context of Crassus.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep.
So we can question how much perhaps Plutarch actually cares about Spartacus's motivations, because at the end of the day, perhaps they don't particularly matter. What matters is how Crassus deals with what happens, right? It's all about Crassus.
Yep.
No one cares about Spartacus.
No.
Really. Again, because it's such a kind of anticlimax, the same as how they found with Kubrick, that you have this potential of real change, social change, revolution, which people love to think about. I mean, especially not so much in my country, but in France, you guys, revolution, independence, that kind of thing. And he fails.
Mm-hmm.
It is such a depressing story if you look at it from Spartacus is our hero instead of Crassus is the hero. And I will say, actually, the series that Crassus finally does pop up in is his characterization is quite cool. I think you're going to like it.
Ooh, okay, I'm excited.
But, yeah.
As excited as I can be to continue watching this series.
Yeah, right?
I'm not surprised that we had a lot to say about this one. So, let me pull up my closing spiel. Well, ladies and ladies' night. It was lovely to have us all here, and special thanks to Alexandra Sills for joining us once again and having us put the female gaze on the show that was wholly created for the male gaze.
Yes.
As for you listeners, you can find us on most major streaming platforms, as well as movieswedig.com. Please like, review, and subscribe if you like what you hear. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Blue Sky under some variation of the handle @movieswedig. And we'll be continuing this series on. Hopefully we'll get some more fun guests to unpack it with us. And in the meantime, I wish us all a good night.
Woo!
Bye!